Hi and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this series of videos I'm taking a look at David Lewis's book on the plurality of worlds. And in this particular video I want to take a look at section 1.4, a very long section called Modal Realism at Work, Content. Now this section 1.4 consists of two parts. A longer part about belief and a shorter part about semantics, about meaning in language. In the video I will be mostly looking at the first longer part, the part about belief, and I will say only very briefly something about the second part of section 1.4. Now I also need to make an admission, and the admission is that in the first video I kind of promised that I would not be spending so much time sort of criticizing Lewis's framework from without. I would be spending most of my time inside Lewis's framework, trying to understand what he's doing. I am already, in this second video, going to break that promise, right? I am going to spend almost all of my time basically criticizing what Lewis is doing, because I think what is so fascinating about section 1.4, about the way that Lewis handles belief, is that it shows in a very fundamental way so the limitations and weaknesses of his possible worlds approach. And so that is something that I want to discuss. So let me remind you of the strategy that Lewis is pursuing in this part of chapter 1 of On the Plurality of Worlds. Right? What Lewis has told us is he has told us that the main reason to embrace realism about possibilia, to embrace realism about possible worlds, to engage in possible worlds talk and take it seriously as, any other theory that we have, is that it is so useful in philosophy. And so what Lewis is doing in these first set of paragraphs is he is trying to show that it's useful, right? So he has tried to show us that we can talk about counterfactuals, that we can talk about modality using possible worlds, and now he is going to show that we can talk about content. For instance, the content of belief or the content of language, belief and meaning, using possible worlds. And so what this section is supposed to do is it is supposed to justify possible worlds talk by showing us how beautiful and elegant and nice all these things look once we engage in possible worlds talk. Now, for me, at least, the impression that section 1.4 generates is not that impression, right? It turns out, and in fact, Lewis says this himself, and he says it, for instance, at page 34, where he has been talking about belief sentences, and when we can say that somebody believes a certain sentence, believes that some particular sentence is true, he tells us this. He says, never mind. I have made my point that the connection of belief sentences with belief as characterized by doxastic alternatives, and doxastic alternatives is one of the things that we can talk about once we accept possible words talk, as characterized by doxastic alternatives is complicated and multifarious. And actually this is going to be the conclusion again and again. Also when we come to the part about meaning, for instance, it turns out that everything is really complicated. There are lots of problems and we can sort of indicate maybe strategies for trying to solve them. But it's not the case that we somehow have a beautiful philosopher's paradise. So those kind of statements or those kinds of conclusions do not really seem to work positively within the strategic framework that Lewis has been setting up, right? I mean, if the goal of these sections is to persuade us that we should take possible worlds seriously because they make everything simple, and it turns out that everything is really complicated once we try to analyze it in possible worlds terms, that sort of undermines the purpose of the section. So that is sort of a very broad claim that I want to make about what is going on here. Now, of course, judgments about whether it turns out to be simple or it turns out to be complicated are very subjective. Still, Lewis seems to share some of these subjective appraisals that what is going on turns out to be quite complicated. Now, maybe those complications are, it's just because the subject matter is complicated. Right? And it's not a problem with the possible worlds, it's a problem with the subject matter, and possible worlds at least, allow us to approach the subject matter in a simpler way than any other approach. Well, maybe, although Lewis does nothing to persuade us of that, because he doesn't talk about any other possible approaches. But actually, I think there are some pretty deep reasons to think that a lot of the complications that we meet in this chapter are pretty much internal to the possible worlds approach. They are generated by the possible worlds approach. So let us look at what happens in the beginning of this section 1.4, right, where Lewis talks about epistemically accessible and doxastically accessible worlds. And so the basic idea would be that the content of my belief, or my belief system, I should say, sort of all of my beliefs together, all of my beliefs considered holistically, the content of my belief system can be given by a set of possible worlds. Which set of possible worlds? Well, the doxastically accessible worlds. Those worlds that fit my belief system. I'm not sure how far this gets us as an analysis, right? If somebody says, well, I don't really know what to think about belief. I mean, what is belief? What is the content of a belief? And somebody says, well, the content of your belief system is the set of doxastically accessible worlds. What do we win by this move, right? This is not, I would say, really explained very well. But then Lewis gives us some reasons for adding further complications. In fact, reasons for making a move from talking about these doxastically accessible worlds to talking about doxastic alternatives. And doxastic alternatives, that's basically everyone, not in this world, but everyone in the realm of possible worlds that I could, given my own beliefs, be. Right? And so the idea would be that the content of my belief system is defined by the people out there in the realm of possible worlds that I might be. Again, it's very unclear, I would say, that this gives us any, new purchase, new understanding of what belief is. Right? It seems to sort of, or what the content of beliefs are. It seems very unnatural to think of my beliefs in terms of who I believe I might be among the set of all possible worlds, something that I couldn't possibly have like a grasp of, given the fact that this is some kind of infinite set. But we'll leave that aside for a moment, because what I want to zoom in on are the kind of problems that lead Lewis to introduce this notion of doxastic alternatives. And so these are problems that have to do with our location, with who we are. And Lewis tells us, for instance, that somebody might have a complete set of beliefs about the world and yet have no opinion about who he is within that world. Right? And in order to make this scenario somewhat plausible, Lewis paints for us the picture of a world that has future-directed eternal recurrence. So a world started at one point, like it really started, there's no time before that maybe, and then some stuff happens, and then the same stuff happens, and the same stuff happens, and the same stuff happens. And so I could believe that that is the world, but have no idea where I am in it, right? Am I in the first recurrence, or the second recurrence, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth, or who knows? I don't know whether this really is a possible world, by the way. I mean, that seems to require certain metaphysical assumptions, but let's assume that, this is one of the possible worlds. Why is this case, or why could we know in advance that this kind of case would be problematic for a strict possible worlds analysis? And how could we know also in advance that something like the question of my belief about how late it is, right? I can have complete beliefs about the world, like I know every way that the world is, but I don't know what time it is, right? That is also, one of the problems that Lewis is talking about here. Well, the reason that these problems come up is that in the possible worlds approach, we look at worlds sort of externally from God's point of view, right? We're not thinking of ourselves primarily as somebody who is in a world, as somebody who is sort of essentially a finite, limited knower in time, in some kind of causal network. No, we are taking the sort of God's eye point of view. We are trying to understand everything from this God's eye point of view. And at this point in the book, we are even trying to understand beliefs and the contents of beliefs in terms that are accessible in this God's eye point of view, where we see all the possible worlds stretched out before us. Now, thinking of possible worlds as something in something that is seen from God's point of view is not very problematic if you're Leibniz. Because if you are Leibniz, you literally believe that these possible worlds are the thoughts of God. But when you're not Leibniz, and you're not trying to tell us a theological story about God, but you're trying to tell us a story about us, there's one massive problem with the God's eye point of view, which is that it has abstracted away from the fact that you are a finite embedded thinker within one of these worlds. Right? That is information that is not present anywhere in the God's eye point of view. It couldn't be present in the God's eye point of view, and it's not even present when we point out one of these worlds as the actual world. Right? I mean, if this is the actual world, well, that's fine, but it doesn't tell me anything about who I am, where I am located in this world. So we need to do something else, right? We need to, because we have decided to think in terms of this, in terms of what appears from God's point of view, what is there from God's point of view, we now need to do extra work in order to return to our own embedded finite perspective. How do we do that? Well, it seems maybe logical that you should drop the God's point of view, right? We don't have God's point of view. We can't understand ourselves, and we can't understand our own situation as knowers from that God's point of view. But of course, if you do that, then you are rejecting Lewis's entire approach. So that is not what Lewis is doing. What Lewis is going to do is he is going to introduce this idea of doxastic alternatives. So what I believe is not primarily that I am in one of this bunch of possible worlds. What I believe is primarily that I am one among these possible people, right? So across all these possible worlds, there are all these possible people, and the content of my belief system is that I am one of these, and not the other, but these possible people. That is fundamentally the content of my belief system. And so, for Lewis, if I believe that it is 4:15, the content of that belief is that I believe that for everyone, for all my doxastic alternatives, it is at their, local point in the universe, 4:15. That is what it means to believe that it is 4:15. It is not, a belief that is sort of essentially the belief of a finite embedded thinker inside time. No, it is sort of a belief that we can formulate from God's point of view. We can, from God's point of view, take this class of people out there in the realm of possible worlds and say, well, there's all of them. I'm one of them. I'm one of those. And that means that I believe it's 4:15. Okay. Well, two things I want to say about that. The first is that it doesn't sound... If somebody gives me this analysis and says, oh, look, Philosopher's Paradise, it only sounds like Philosopher's Paradise in the sense that it will allow us to write lots and lots of complicated technical papers. It doesn't sound like Philosopher's Paradise in the sense that, oh, yes, this is so simple and intuitive and I'm ready to embrace it. Second thing I want to say is that this entire technical apparatus, talking about doxastic alternatives in order to be able to say that I believe that it is a certain time, all of that is only necessary because we have chosen the possible worlds approach, because we have adopted this God's point of view and are trying to understand, even believe, in terms of something that is essentially not the perspective of a finite embedded thinker. So this really is sort of a point where we can see what the possible worlds approach brings us. And it seems to me that it brings us a lot of trouble. Okay, so Lewis himself says this on page 29. He says, so belief about the world comes out as a special case of egocentric belief. And that is, I mean, if you think that we ought to believe, ought to sort of start, that our starting point ought to be the idea that we are finite embedded thinkers, then this is trivial, right? Of course, every belief is a case of egocentric belief, right? Because that is sort of what we are as thinkers. For Lewis, this is sort of, a kind of inconvenient fact that requires some extra technical apparatus on top of the apparatus of possible worlds. But then we can sort of deal with it. And I guess one of the fundamental philosophical questions here is whether you really deal with it that way, right? Whether that really does justice to the sense in which belief is egocentric, and not from God's point of view. All right, as you can imagine, my answer to that is yes. No, my answer to that is no. It doesn't do justice to that. I don't know whether Lewis's answer is yes. Right? This seems to be the kind of issue that Lewis is not really considering, that he's not maybe really interested in. So what follows is a rather interesting discussion about doublethink, about the possibility of believing inconsistent things, right? And I take it that one of the things that Lewis wants to do is he wants to suggest a way of understanding doublethink, right? A way of understanding doublethink is that, I believe that among my doxastic alternatives are these, sort of incompatible kinds of people, and I sort of switch between them. At one point I believe that, and at another point I believe something else. Now, one thing I want to point out about this is that if all the tools that we have at our disposal is the tools that we have just been given, that is pointing in this realm of possible worlds at some class of possible people and saying, these are my doxastic alternatives, that will not allow us to make a difference between somebody who double thinks and somebody who holds a disjunctive belief. Right? So take Lewis's example of somebody who thinks that at some moments he thinks, I am healthy, I'm fine, and at other moments he thinks, I have this terrible disease. Right? So that's a type of double think. Right? At some point he really believes that he's healthy, and at some points he really believes that he has a terrible disease. Here's somebody else who has the belief that either I am perfectly healthy or I have a terrible disease. That's a disjunctive belief, and it's not doublethink, right? I could think that, there's nothing inconsistent about it. If all that we have is the ability to point at a particular class of doxastic alternatives, then these two cases are identical. Right? Because the doxastic alternatives of these two people are all, is some group of people, some of whom are very healthy and some of them are very diseased, spread out across the realm of possible worlds. In order to make the distinction between somebody who double thinks and somebody who just has a disjunctive belief, we will have to do something else, right? We will have to say something like, well, but this person sort of really believes it at the same time, and this person doesn't. This person's belief is compartmentalized, and this person's belief isn't compartmentalized, but is, just disjunctive. And they're aware of that. And it's I don't know exactly how Lewis would want to do that, but it generates at least the suspicion that we need to say more, that we sort of need to bring in some kind of content some kind of belief or ways of believing or contents of beliefs that are not captured by the technical apparatus that is supposed to do the capturing for us. Okay, so I mean, Lewis doesn't really say enough about it for us to delve into that, but that is a remark that I did want to make. So, as we move through the paragraph, what we are going to find is that Lewis talks about all these, complicated questions like degrees of belief and believing in the truth of particular sentences. And he does what he is really good at, which is to sort of make all these distinctions, show us all these special cases, argue about how we might be able to handle those special cases, often in ways that are very clear. But, again, which are also kind of complicated and so don't really do much in order to convince us that possible worlds talk is all that it's cracked up to be. And then we get, and this is at page 36, we get to Lewis's attempt to tell us more about what belief really is. Right? And here's what he writes on page 36. He says, if the content of belief, as given in terms of the subject's doxastic alternatives, is not tied in any uniform and straightforward way to the truth of ordinary language ascriptions of belief, and is also not tied to the subject acceptance of inner sentences, how is it tied down at all? I would say that it is tied down mainly by belief-desire psychology. We suppose that people tend to behave in a way that serves their desires according to their beliefs. We should take this principle of instrumental rationality to be neither descriptive nor normative, but constitutive of belief. It enters into the implicit definition of what it is for someone to have a certain system of belief. And so what we get here is a sort of behaviorist analysis of belief, right? And the basic underlying idea is that you have a belief just in case you act on it, right? You have a belief just in case you act on it. And of course, in order to make that in order to ever say that somebody acts on a belief, we also need to think about their desires. I mean, I may believe that there is juice in the fridge, but that will only make me go to the fridge if I desire to have some juice, and it will make me avoid the fridge if I am, desire to avoid juice. So we need to bring desires into the picture as well. But, these are sort of the basic ingredients of a picture that Lewis is now going to paint about what it means for somebody to have a belief. This turns out to be, again, quite a complicated story. Lewis tries to tell this on page 37, and he says, okay, so what we need to think of, my doxastic alternatives, who are, the people that I think I might be. And there's another group of the people who I want to be. And then, my beliefs and desires have to do with how my doxastic alternatives relate to those people whom I would like to be, to this preferred class. And here is what Lewis tells us. He said, each alternative, this is page 37, each alternative is such that the closest world to his, where his counterpart waves, is one where his counterpart belongs to the preferred class. Right? So in order to understand belief, we have to think about, who I think I might be and who I want to be, and how the people, from the point of view of each of the people that I might be, we have to look at those worlds in which people act in a certain way and see whether that act brings them, that the people who act that way are part of the preferred class. And if they are, then my beliefs and desires are such that I'm going to act in this way. Okay, that is kind of complicated, but that is the way it works, right? So my beliefs are, the content of my beliefs is defined by the people I think I might be, my doxastic alternatives. The contents of my desires are defined by the people I would prefer to be, my preferred class. And now my beliefs and desires will bring me to act in a certain way, just in case my doxastic alternatives are such that for each of them, the person who acts in this particular way is in the preferred class. Or I guess at least is not, in a less preferred class than if they hadn't acted that way, or if they had acted in some alternative way. Okay, well, this is very complicated. It tries to define beliefs and desires purely in terms of actions. Actually, purely in terms of behavior, I should say. I mean, it can't be actions under a description, right? It can't be that I am getting the juice. That can't be the description of my behavior in one of these worlds. It has to be something like I am walking to, or I walk in the direction of the fridge and pull it open and grab a can of juice, something like that. Something that doesn't prejudge what the beliefs and desires are. And so one of the things that appears from this discussion of Lewis is that he thinks that those possible worlds, they are the ingredients of a way of ascribing beliefs and desires to people, right? The possible worlds, the realm of possible worlds, including its closeness relations, are ingredients in an algorithm that we can use to ascribe beliefs and desires to people. Well, that means that the basic descriptions of those worlds and our grasp, or the reality, maybe I should say, of how close worlds are to each other, can't mention beliefs and desires. Right? I think this is a very important point, and so I want to repeat it. In order for it to be possible to ascribe beliefs and desires to people, distributed among possibility space, in terms of what happens in all those worlds and how close those worlds are to each other, it had better not be the case that we already describe those worlds in terms of people having certain beliefs and desires, right? Or that we already judge closeness relations between possible worlds in terms of what people believe and desire, right? Because that would make the entire procedure, well, first of all, circular, and second of all, absurd. So that's not the case, right? So clearly Lewis is thinking about possible worlds and the closeness between possible worlds as something that can be completely described and understood without ever referring to beliefs or desires. And so, when Lewis told us that every possible way for things to be is a possible world, he isn't primarily thinking about possibilities like me believing that this is a bust of Schopenhauer. Right? I don't believe it's a bust of Schopenhauer. I believe it's a bust of Nietzsche, but surely it's possible for me to believe that it's a bust of Schopenhauer. Well, maybe there are worlds where I believe that it's a bust of Schopenhauer, but if there are, that is because some other possibility, some other thing is possible. Maybe some brain state is possible that then at some point in our methodology gets ascribed the belief this is a bust of Schopenhauer. Also, like relations of closeness can't be based on what people believe or desire in those worlds. Why is this important? Well, I think one of the reasons it's important, first of all, it seems that, at the beginning, Lewis seemed very, he seemed to allow for a lot, right? Everything that you can think is possible somewhere. Well, apparently beliefs and desires do not primarily count. If alternative beliefs and desires turn out to be possible, it's only because they are somehow based in other possibilities. Furthermore, it means that, I would say, we are going to face some very complicated and maybe unsolvable questions about, let's say, counterfactuals having to do with beliefs and desires. Right? If I say something like, well, if I desired an orange juice, I would now pause this video and walk to the fridge. Why do I think that? Well, I think that because, I believe that there is orange juice in the fridge. And so, presumably, I believe that in the closest possible worlds to this one, I still believe that there is orange juice in the fridge. But now it turns out that there's no basis for that. Right? Because closeness has nothing to do with what I believe. Closeness is determined before We can even ascribe beliefs. So there is no prima facie reason to believe that the worlds closest to ours, to the real one, are ones where I have the same beliefs or the same desires that I actually do. Right? There seems to be absolutely no reason to believe that. Believing that seems to be sort of, I mean, if it's true at all, it's going to sort of come out of the equation at the end of some kind of algorithm where we have already determined closeness by other ways. I have no idea which ways, right? Maybe by checking out my physical brain state or something like that. All of this seems to only make sense if we have some kind of I don't know, physicalist presupposition, which Lewis doesn't make explicit. And which might worry us, right? Because we're trying to understand what beliefs are and what the contents of beliefs are. And it seems, at the very least dubious that we can ever get the contents of beliefs or the notion of belief or anything like that out of any story if we don't add anything normative, right? And we're not adding anything normative because it seems that we're just having some kind of physicalist picture of the world. We're just describing brain states, apparently, and how much they look like each other. But what is that to do with belief? I don't know. This is maybe a special version of this egocentric problem, right? I mean, it's this whole behaviorist approach works kind of well, or at least has a certain plausibility from God's point of view, right? Or from any third person point of view. If I really want to know whether somebody believes that there's orange juice in the fridge, I can check their behavior and see whether they do things like say, I want some orange juice, and then move to get some orange juice or anything like that. But from my own point of view, when I ascribe beliefs to myself, right, and that's, what we're talking about, right? Because all beliefs are egocentric beliefs, Lewis has told us. When I ascribe beliefs to myself, I don't do that in terms of my own behavior, right? It's not like I'm wondering whether I believe whether there's any juice in the fridge, and I'm like, well, I hope I'm going to get the desire for juice sometime soon, because then I can check whether I believe that there is juice in the fridge. I'll keep an eye out on my behavior, and then at some point I, have this feeling of I want orange juice, and I see myself move downstairs to the fridge, and I think, aha, so I did in fact believe that there's orange juice in the fridge. That's not how self-ascription of belief works at all, right? When I say that I believe that there's orange juice in the fridge, I'm saying that there's orange juice in the fridge. I'm not making a claim about my behavior. I'm making a claim about the world. And I'm making a normative claim too, right? I'm making the claim that I, given my evidence, ought to believe that there's orange juice in the fridge. And none of that seems to be possible here. So I don't know whether Lewis wants to deal with that, how he wants to deal with that. But I do want to stress that none of this is philosophically neutral. Right? It's not the case that anyone can pick this up and say, oh, that's nice, Lewis. What you're doing with belief, what you're doing with content here. Yeah, I'm going to accept your view of things. This God's eye point of view, this third person point of view, seems to sort of run through the text at every point and generates complications and philosophical puzzles at every point. And so anyone who thinks that those puzzles and complications are unsolvable, that we ought to start from this first person perspective of the embedded knower, will have to sort of reject almost everything that happens here. So that is almost everything that I wanted to say about this. And I want to end with a final and I would say the most fundamental doubt that I have about the approach that is being taken in this section 1.4. So what we have seen is that according to Lewis, the content of my belief system is defined by or is expressed as the idea that I am one of all these possible people. Right? So there's all these possible worlds and there are all these possible people and there's some subclass of them that I think I might be. And that, that subclass defines the content of my belief system. Okay, so here's the puzzle or the paradox. Suppose that I believe that there are no possible worlds. Suppose that I believe that there is just this one world and that modal realism is false. What is the content of a belief system involving that belief on Lewis's picture? Well, there's no way to answer that, right? Because clearly it is false for everyone in Lewis's modal realist universe that they live in a universe in which there is only one world. There is no class of doxastic alternatives such that they are the people who live in worlds that are the only single one world, that they live in the worlds where modal realism is false. And so it turns out, now I don't think that this means that Lewis's philosophy sort of falls down, that it becomes impossible. What this means is just that a belief in modal realism acts in the same way as a belief in the laws of logic. Right? There's no possible world in which a contradiction is true, and there's no possible world in which modal realism is false. To believe that the laws of logic are false is impossible, right? That's unintelligible. You can't believe that that the laws of logic are false. I mean, check it out. There are no doxastic alternatives living in worlds where the laws of logic are false. So it can't be the content of any belief system that the laws of logic are false. In the same way, it can't be the content of any belief system that modal realism is false, if Lewis's analysis of belief is true. And so the only possible conclusion to draw from Lewis's analysis of belief is that the denial of modal realism is literally unintelligible. You cannot believe that modal realism is false. But Lewis's methodological picture was very different. Right? Lewis has been telling us that we ought to accept modal realism because it's so useful. And it has all these nice applications. And, there are these pragmatic reasons for becoming modal realists. And his entire way of arguing is by giving us pragmatic reasons to become modal realists. But it can't be the case that there are some merely pragmatic reasons for adopting a theory, the logical conclusion of which is that its own denial is literally incomprehensible. Right? If the denial of modal realism is literally unintelligible, then that's what Lewis should show. And I use the word show like with a deliberate echo, I would say, of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. But he would have to argue for it or show it that modal realism really is the only possible thought, that a denial of modal realism doesn't work, because if it is possible to deny modal realism, if it is intelligible that modal realism might be false, then Lewis's theory of the content of belief cannot be true. And so there seems to be a very fundamental incoherence here in the way that Lewis tries to understand content in terms of possible worlds and our doxastic alternatives. And that is the argument with which I want to end this video. Thanks for listening to it.